David Castle was used to seeing his neighbor Olivia Madison arrive and leave in her car at the same time as he did. At least that's what he thought until the night he came home at 2:30 a.m. and saw Mrs. Madison in her car, apparently fast asleep. Had she locked herself out, David wondered? And then he realized that he'd never actually seen Mrs. Madison drive her car, not once. Worried, David approached the beat-up old Ford and peered inside. Mrs. Madison was reclining in the front seat of the passenger side, covered by a thick comforter, fast asleep. In the back seat were several boxes of groceries and basic necessities neatly organized. It was obvious. Mrs. Madison, 79 years old, was living in her car. But why, wondered David aghast. She owned the house next to his, a pretty Victorian two-story which had started to look sadly neglected after Mr. Madison's death 3 years before. David walked back outside and approached Mrs. Madison's car again. He knocked gently on the window until Mrs. Madison's eyelids fluttered. Mrs. Madison woke up and she looked a little frightened, but David's kindly smile reassured her. "Mrs. Madison, please come out of the car and come inside. My wife has a nice cup of hot chocolate for you in a warm bed." "I'm not leaving unless you come with me," David said firmly, and finally Mrs. Madison opened the door and got out of the car. David wrapped her in her comforter and led her up the path to his door. Inside, Lydia waited with a promised cup of hot chocolate. Mrs. Madison took the first sip and tears filled her eyes. "Mrs. Madison, why were you sleeping in your car?" asked Lydia gently. Mrs. Madison closed her eyes. "I can't go home, you see, not since Charlie—" "You haven't been home since your husband passed away?" asked David, shocked. Mrs. Madison was weeping silently. "I did at first," she explained, "but then there was this terrible silence where he used to be, and then suddenly I'd open a drawer or a door and I'd smell him like he'd just been there. I couldn't constantly live with his absence or with the reminders, David. I couldn't live with that pain. So one night I just took my comforter and came out to the car. That was the first peaceful night for me since Charlie had passed, so I started sleeping out here. But soon I couldn't stand going into the house for anything. I had the water and lights switched off and began living in my car. It's been 2 years now. You're the first person who noticed." "But how do you manage for bathroom facilities, I mean? I've been a member of a senior citizen gym group for 10 years. I used to go with Charlie," said Mrs. Madison. "So I go there, have my bath and whatnot, and I manage." "Mrs. Madison," said David gently, "why would you sell the house and move somewhere else?" Mrs. Madison blushed. "Oh, David, I've thought about that, but the house is such a mess." "Well, you go to bed now and tomorrow I'll go look it over, okay?" David said kindly. "And if you allow me to, I'll have the house cleaned up and you can sell it." Mrs. Madison gave David and Lydia a grateful hug. "Thank you, my dears, you've given me hope." The next day, David called a friend of his who had a small business restoring old homes and asked him to visit Mrs. Madison's house with him. When the two men walked into the house, they were shocked. The whole house was covered with layers of dust and thick veils of spiderwebs hung from the ceilings and light fixtures. But worst of all, the walls were covered from floor to ceiling with strange-looking black slime. He went to his car and brought back 2 face masks and a series of glass tubes. The two men went in and David watched as his friend collected samples of the substance he said was mold. David's friend was shaking his head. "Bunny," he said, "this could be bad. I'm taking this to the lab to see what they say, but it may be bad news." "Come on," said David, "I can call in a cleaning service. Just a little mold and dust isn't the end of the world." But David's friend shook his head. "If this is what I think it is, there's no way that this house will ever be clean or safe to live in." "Safe?" asked David. "What do you mean?" "If that is toxic mold, it will have seeped into every crevice of that house, under every floorboard, inside every wall. In fact, if your old lady friend had been living in the house, she'd be seriously ill by now." 3 days later, the news came back from the lab. It was a variation of the very dangerous Stachybotrys mold, which the technicians had never seen before. They reported it as an extreme case and recommend all the spores be destroyed. David told Mrs. Madison the bad news, and the two decided to call the fire department and ask for their help in dealing with the problem. The fire department expert told him that the only way to make sure the mold didn't spread to other homes would be to burn the house. Dismantling the house would send clouds of the spore up into the air and allow them to spread all over the neighborhood. Sadly, Mrs. Madison accepted the fire department's advice and watched as they stayed a carefully controlled fire. And as her old house burned, she wept. David placed a gentle arm around her and said, "You have a home with us, Mrs. Madison, for as long as you want, you know that." Mrs. Madison nodded. "I know, David, thank you, but I was hoping to have my own little place again." David had an idea, but he kept it to himself. The next day, he called a meeting of all the closest neighbors. "As you all know, Mrs. Madison burned down her house to prevent the spread of a toxic mold that could harm us all. I think we should all pitch in to try to solve her problem. Any ideas?" One of the women raised her hand. "I'm a real estate agent and Mrs. Madison's plot is big, much bigger than any of ours. I think I know a developer who might be interested." As it turned out, the developer was very interested and David negotiated an excellent deal on behalf of Mrs. Madison. The developer was building a series of assisted living cottages, and as part of the generous payoff, Mrs. Madison got to live in one of the best units for life. Thanks to David's kindness, Mrs. Madison received a good price for her plot and a little independent home all of her own, and she stayed in the neighborhood she loved next door to her best friends, David and Lydia Castle.